Long before that Saturday in June, my little house had stopped feeling like a home. It was quiet in the wrong way, the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe you, but amplifies every memory you wish you could mute. My divorce had been final for 6 months, but the traces of him still lingered everywhere. The faint dent in the couch where he always sat, the ceramic coffee mugs we bought together at a craft fair in Vermont, the smell of leather from the jacket hanging by the door, untouched since the day he walked out. I kept telling myself I'd get around to cleaning things out, boxing them up, donating them. But every time I opened a closet or drawer, I found something that pulled me back into a loop of remembering. My therapist, a woman named Dana with soft eyes and sharper instincts, finally told me, "You don't need to keep holding this weight. Letting go isn't forgetting. It's making room for your life now." So I decided to sell it all. Not everything, but enough to make my space feel like mine again. I picked a Saturday in mid-June, the kind of humid Connecticut morning where the air feels thick before breakfast. I pulled the folding tables out from the garage, wiped off the spiderwebs, and started laying out the things I no longer wanted to keep. There were boxes of china still wrapped in tissue from our wedding registry, picture frames without the photos, the mountain bike my ex bought during a burst of optimism about getting into cycling that lasted exactly 2 weeks. It was a good bike, lightweight frame, perfect tires, and worth every bit of the $300 I put on the price tag. By 8 o'clock I was ready. A small cluster of neighbors came by first, most of them curious about what I had, making polite conversation. The steady rhythm of haggling felt almost comforting. For a while I could almost forget why I was doing this. Then the black Dodge Ram pulled up. It was old, but loud, the kind of truck that announces itself before you even see it. A woman climbed out, maybe late 40s, wearing a bright yellow cardigan over a floral scarf that looked like it belonged in October, not June. She moved with the kind of confidence that felt more like intrusion, like she'd already decided which part of my sale belonged to her. Her eyes landed on the mountain bike. She walked straight to it, touched the handlebars, then looked at me. "How much?" "$300, I said. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're not getting more than 40 for that." Her tone wasn't playful bargaining, it was flat, dismissive, almost insulting. "I'll stick with my price," I said, keeping my voice light. She stared for a moment longer than necessary, like she was trying to memorize my face. Then she muttered something I couldn't catch, turned, and walked back to her truck. I tried to shake it off, but when I looked up, 10 minutes later, she was still there, parked across the street, engine idling, cigarette in hand, just watching. The morning moved on. Other people came and went. I let myself believe she was just killing time before running errands. But somewhere in my gut, I knew I'd see her again. It was just after 9:30 when the man appeared. He wasn't a stranger in the sense that he looked unfamiliar. No, he was a stranger in the way you instinctively recognize you've never crossed paths before. Broad shoulders, worn work boots, faded baseball cap pulled low. He walked straight past every table, his gaze locked on the bike. "You're gonna take 40 for it, right?" he said, like it wasn't a question. I shook my head. "I've already got offers close to my price." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Don't play stubborn, my wife doesn't like being disrespected." I blinked. "Disrespected?" She asked a price, I told her. He stepped closer, dropping his voice so only I could hear. "Say no. Prices can change real fast when you're scared enough. You think people like you can just..." The words landed like a cold weight in my stomach. Before I could respond, a couple browsing the dishware turned toward us. The woman's eyes narrowed as she caught the tone in his voice. She pulled her phone from her pocket, holding it like a weapon. "I'm calling the cops if you don't leave right now." For a long second, he didn't move. Then he glanced over his shoulder at the truck, where the woman in the yellow cardigan was still sitting, cigarette dangling from her fingers. Slowly, he stepped back. "You'll regret this," he said under his breath, before turning and walking away. The woman in the truck met my eyes with a look that could have cut glass. I thought it was over. For the next few hours, I told myself it was over, that the couple had driven off to bother someone else, and I was just letting my imagination stretch shadows into monsters. But the truth was I couldn't relax. Every time a car slowed near the curb, my eyes flicked up. Every time footsteps crunched on the sidewalk, my shoulders tightened. I caught myself scanning the street more often than I greeted customers. It was around 2 o'clock when I saw it again, the black Dodge Ram. It wasn't in front of my house, not exactly. It was parked 2 houses down, angled just enough so the driver's seat had a line of sight straight toward my yard. The windows were tinted dark, but I didn't need to see their faces to know who it was. The same faint thrum of the engine, the same shape of the front grille. I recognized it the way you recognize the voice of someone you wish you'd never met. I tried to keep moving, folding clothes, rearranging the few items left on the tables. But the presence of that truck felt like a hand pressing down on my chest. No one got out, no horn, no calls, just waiting, watching. An elderly man came to browse through my stack of vinyl records, and I forced myself to smile and make small talk, though my eyes kept drifting to the street. After he left, the truck was still there. It didn't leave until I started packing up around 3:30. The sound of the engine pulling away should have felt like relief, but it didn't. If anything, it felt like someone pulling a knife away only to hide it behind their back. I was so rattled that when I carried the last box into the house, I tripped on the porch step and dropped it. Glass shattered across the entryway, but I barely noticed. I locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, and left the mess until later. That night I moved through the house like it was enemy territory, checking locks twice, jumping at the sound of the refrigerator cycling on. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that people haggle aggressively all the time, that maybe they'd forgotten me already. But fear doesn't listen to reason. It listens to the way his voice had dropped when he told me prices could change real fast. It listens to the way she had stared from that truck unmoving. By midnight, I was still awake, sitting in bed with the lamp on, listening for an engine that didn't come. The next day was Sunday. I woke with a headache and the faint memory of dreams I couldn't piece together, only that they'd been about the sound of boots on gravel. I tried to distract myself, cleaned the kitchen, went for a run, called my sister in Boston to tell her about the yard sale without mentioning the worst part. But even with the TV on, the house felt too quiet, like I was listening for something. In the afternoon, I had to run to the grocery store. The parking lot was busy, the kind of weekend crowd where you can get lost in the shuffle. I was halfway down the frozen foods aisle when I caught a whiff of something, heavy, artificial perfume. My skin prickled before my brain could catch up. I turned. A woman was walking past the end of the aisle. Yellow cardigan. I stood frozen, watching her disappear behind a stack of paper towel packs. I told myself it was just someone with the same sweater, but my body didn't buy it. My hands shook as I paid for my groceries. I didn't see her again before I left, but when I got to my car, I sat there for a full minute scanning the lot. No black Dodge Ram, no yellow cardigan, just rows of SUVs and sedans. Still, when I pulled into my driveway, I did a slow loop around the block first. That night, I kept the porch light on, slept with the phone on my nightstand, and somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m., I woke up sure I'd heard the faint crunch of gravel outside. By Monday morning, I'd made my decision. The bike was going online. I didn't care if I made less money or if I had to haul it to the shipping center myself. I just wanted it gone. I listed it that afternoon. Within a week, it was sold to someone 3 states away. I thought maybe that would close the chapter, but the feeling never really left. I didn't see the Dodge Ram again, but every time I walked to my car, I caught myself scanning the street. The yellow cardigan showed up in my mind in random moments. In the produce section, at a red light, at the sound of boots somewhere behind me. In the end, the lesson wasn't about yard sales or even about the bike. It was about the thin line between normal interactions and the kind that cross into something darker. How quickly politeness can become a weapon in someone else's hands. I haven't had another yard sale since. I've gotten rid of things in quieter ways. Donations, online listings, discreet handoffs to friends. Maybe I lost some money doing it that way, but I gained something else. Distance. Control. That Saturday taught me the price of letting go isn't always measured in dollars. Sometimes it's in how much safety you're willing to trade for the sake of a deal. And I know now, some bargains are far too expensive. When you clean out a house after someone dies, you don't just find things. You find pieces of yourself you forgot existed. My mother's little blue house on Willow Bend Road smelled the same as it had when I was a kid. Lavender sachets, brewed coffee, and a faint undercurrent of mothballs. The kind of scent that lives in old wood and never really leaves. She passed away in June. The cancer had been quick, which was merciful in some ways, cruel in others. My siblings were scattered across the country, both with families and busy lives, so the task of clearing her home fell to me. At first, I moved through the rooms like a machine, sorting into neat piles, keep, donate, trash. But the deeper I dug, the more personal it got. A hand-knit scarf I'd made in the 6th grade, uneven and full of holes. Birthday cards from relatives long gone. Boxes of porcelain dolls, each with a name my mother had written on a tiny tag tied around its wrist. Those dolls, I never liked them. Their glass eyes always seemed to follow me, and some had hair so real I half expected it to grow. But to my mother, they were treasures. She'd scour estate sales for them, talk about their stories, and dust them weekly like fragile pets. 2 weeks into the process, I realized I couldn't keep them all. I couldn't keep most of anything. Not if I wanted to move forward without drowning in the past. So I decided to hold a yard sale. It felt practical. Sell what I could, give the rest away. But as I lined the dolls on a folding table that Sunday morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was putting something private on display. Like strangers would be touching the pieces of my mother's life that should have stayed behind closed doors. By 7:40, the first cars were parking along the gravel shoulder. The early birds, the kind who scan for treasures like their hunting game. Most were polite. A woman in a sun visor bought a quilt for her granddaughter. A man in overalls haggled for a box of mystery novels. Then he arrived. He was tall and gaunt, with a gray overcoat despite the warm September air. His hair was slicked back, the kind of shiny that comes from too much pomade, and his eyes never stopped moving. They skipped from table to table until they landed on one of my mother's dolls, a porcelain girl with a cracked cheek and a faded blue dress. "You have any old things?" he asked, voice low. The china sat beside him. "Older than this junk?" He gestured toward. "These are all from the 70s and 80s, I said. "Nothing earlier." He didn't seem to hear me. He picked up the doll, turning it in his hands, running a fingertip along the crack. "This one's been touched," he murmured, almost to himself. "Excuse me?" I asked, uneasy. "Do you know where she came from?" "My mom collected them," I said. He set the doll down gently, too gently, and asked for a price. I hesitated. $10. A small smile tugged at his mouth. "People take them and bad things follow. Things like this, they don't belong out here in the open." I laughed, though my voice was tight. "Well, then I guess you're doing her a favor." He didn't laugh. Paid in exact change, slipped the doll under his coat. Before leaving, he looked, "If she calls, don't answer." Then he walked to a battered white sedan and drove at me and said, "Away." The rest of the morning passed in fits and starts. People came and went, buying dishes, glassware, a few of the costume jewelry boxes. I tried to shake off the encounter, chalking it up to eccentricity. Yard sales always attract their share of oddballs. Still, the man's words lingered. "If she calls, don't answer." It was the way he said it. Not jokey, not cryptic for the sake of being mysterious, but serious. Like he believed it. Around 11, I noticed the sedan again, parked at the corner of Willow Bend, angled toward the house. The man sat in the driver's seat. When I looked directly at him, his head turned away. I busied myself with customers. A woman bought a doll in a pink dress, another bought a chipped teapot. But every so often, I'd glance back at the corner, and the sedan was still there. By mid-afternoon, the crowd thinned. I began boxing unsold items, the shadows lengthening across the driveway. That's when I heard it. A small click, click, followed by something rolling across the asphalt. A marble. It stopped by my foot. I bent to pick it up. My mother never collected marbles. We didn't even have any in the house. "Lose something?" a voice called. I looked up. He was there, at the edge of the yard, no car in sight. Standing still, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on me. "You need to leave," I said, my voice sharper than I felt. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my request. "It's not me she wants," he said softly. I didn't respond, didn't move. He turned and walked away, disappearing between two neighboring houses. That night I double-checked every lock, drew every curtain. The house felt different without the comfort of daylight, the walls pressing closer. I tried reading in bed, but every creak of the settling wood made my pulse jump. At 2:17 a.m., I woke to a sound. Not the furnace, not the fridge. A tap, tap, tap. Slow and deliberate, like porcelain knocking against wood. I slipped from bed, moving toward the living room. The tapping stopped. The streetlight outside cast a pale glow across the coffee table. The doll sat there, the one I had sold that morning. My breath caught. I scanned the room. No broken windows, no open doors, nothing disturbed except for the doll. I called the police. They came, searched the house, found nothing. Suggested maybe I had forgotten to sell it. I knew they didn't believe me, and I didn't blame them. But I knew that doll had left with the man in the gray overcoat. And now it was back. The next day, I put the doll in a cardboard box, taped it shut, and drove it to the county dump. I didn't tell anyone why. Just paid the disposal fee and watched it disappear into the heap. For the rest of the day, I tried to convince myself it was over. I cleaned. I organized the few boxes I was keeping. But that night, lying in bed, I swore I heard something faint in the walls. A soft tap, 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 like a fingernail against wood. I didn't check. Weeks have passed. The house is nearly empty now, ready for the market. I still haven't told my siblings the full story. I don't think they'd believe it, or maybe I'm afraid they would. Sometimes I think about the man's last words. If she calls, don't answer. I don't know who she is. I don't want to. But on quiet nights, when the tapping starts up again, I lie very still and try not to breathe too loud. Because I have the sinking feeling that if I listen too closely, I might hear my name. Some things aren't meant to be owned, and some memories aren't meant to be disturbed. In our search to clear the past, we must be careful not to invite parts of it to follow us home. When my father was younger, he had the kind of presence that filled a room before he even walked into it. 6 feet tall, square shoulders, military posture, the kind of man who made you want to stand up straighter without realizing it. He'd been an army mechanic in Vietnam, but he never liked to talk about it. Every once in a while, late at night, he'd tell a small story about the heat, the bugs, the noise, but never about the people, and never about what he brought back. The stroke changed everything. One minute he was fixing his own lawnmower in the garage. The next he was lying on the concrete, half conscious, his words tangled and slurred. The doctors said he'd need assisted living. He didn't argue. That scared me more than the stroke itself. My dad was never one to surrender anything without a fight. That left me with his house. It was a small 2-story place on Laurel Drive, Pine Hollow, Vermont. Cozy from the outside, but inside, it was a museum of his life. Military plaques, framed unit photos, shelves of old National Geographic magazines stacked so high they looked like yellow brick towers. And the attic, well, the attic was another world entirely. When I was a kid, I was allowed up there only if he was with me. Most of the floor was covered in heavy boxes, each labeled in his sharp block handwriting. Some said Xmas or Tools, but a few had darker markings. Do not open. Those words, written in thick black marker, had been burned into my mind since childhood. I respected the boundaries back then, but now, with the house to myself, I still didn't touch them. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something else. The understanding that not everything in life is yours to know, even if it's sitting right over your head. By the third weekend of cleaning, the attic was still packed. I decided to hold a yard sale. Maybe if I cleared out the everyday stuff, the kitchenware, the spare furniture, the endless piles of tools, I could start to see the house as something other than a monument to my father's past. At 6:55 a.m., before I'd even set out the tables, a rusty blue station wagon pulled into the driveway. The engine coughed to a stop, and the driver's door swung open. Out stepped a woman in her late 50s, wiry frame, sharp eyes, and a windbreaker zipped to her chin despite the warm May air. She didn't say hello, didn't ask if I was ready. She just walked up to me and asked, "Military keepsakes? Anything from overseas?" "Got any?" "My dad served," I said cautiously, "but I'm not selling that stuff." Her smile was thin and strange. "Everything has a price." I shrugged and went back to unpacking the first table. She drifted around the yard without touching much, her eyes sliding over the lamps and tools like she was looking for something else entirely. When she passed under the shadow of the attic window, she stopped, looked up, stared. It was just a second too long to be casual. She left without buying a thing. But when her station wagon rolled away, I had the strange sense she hadn't actually left. By 9, the yard sale was in full swing. The neighborhood kids were flipping through the stack of comics I'd set on a milk crate. A man in overalls bought a battered lawnmower for $20. Someone took the entire box of mismatched mugs off my hands. For a while, the morning felt normal. Small talk, haggling, the occasional laugh. I almost forgot about the woman. Almost. Around 11, she came back. This time, she wasn't alone. A man stepped out of the passenger side, tall, pale, and wearing sunglasses despite the shade from the maple trees. He didn't smile, didn't speak at first. They didn't even pretend to browse. They went straight toward the side of the house, toward the bulkhead door that led to the attic stairs. "Hey," I called out, setting down a box of books. "That's not for customers." The man turned his head slightly, like he'd been waiting for me to speak. A faint smile crept onto his face. "We're just curious," he said in a voice that was too calm. "We know what's up there." A cold ripple passed through me. "You don't," I said firmly. The woman tilted her head in a way that made me think of a bird watching something small and helpless. "You should be careful what you keep locked away," she said. "Things breathe when you shut them in too long." The man's smile deepened, not kindly, not warmly, but like he was enjoying a private joke. They didn't wait for me to reply. They turned and left, walking slow, their footsteps crunching in perfect unison on the gravel. I tried to shake it off. People say creepy things sometimes. Maybe they were antique hunters who'd read too many ghost stories. Still, for the rest of the afternoon, I found myself glancing toward the attic window. Once I swore I saw the curtain shift, though no breeze was moving outside. By 4:30, the sale was winding down. I went inside to grab some empty boxes, and that's when I saw it. The attic door standing open. Just a crack, but open. I hadn't been up there all day. My stomach tightened. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The smell hit me first. Dust, wood, and something faintly metallic. The boxes were all where I'd left them, except one, the largest. The one marked in heavy black letters, "Do not open." In its place was a single piece of paper. Block letters, written with a steady hand. "You can't keep it." I didn't touch the note at first. It sat there on top of the empty space like it was waiting for me to make the first move. The handwriting was too clean, too careful, like someone had taken their time. I picked it up between my thumb and forefinger, half expecting it to be warm, like it had just been written. The paper was cool and dry. The attic around me felt the same, though I could swear the air was heavier than it had been when I'd first come up. My father's do not open box had been here for decades. I'd never even asked about it directly. If something was important enough to label that way, you didn't prod. I went through every corner of the attic just to be sure I wasn't missing it. Nothing. Not under the furniture, not behind the other stacks, not shoved into some shadowed corner. The thing was gone. I locked the attic door, this time sliding a chair under the handle for good measure. The rest of the sale was canceled. I told the last few customers something had come up. They didn't argue. By 6, the tables were cleared. The yard looked like nothing had happened. But that note sat on my kitchen counter, and every time I passed it, I felt a low pulse of unease, like a bruise you can't stop pressing. I thought about calling my dad, but what would I even say? Hey, remember that box you wouldn't let anyone touch? Yeah, it's gone. Also, 2 strangers who knew it existed tried to get into the attic today. No, that conversation would either end with him telling me nothing or telling me something I wouldn't want to hear. By 8, the sun was low, and the quiet on Laurel Drive had settled into that small-town stillness I usually liked. But as I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing a plate, headlights swung into my driveway. The station wagon, the engine idled. No one got out. I reached for my phone, watching the car from between the blinds. Just before I could dial, they turned the engine off. That's when I heard it. Upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not in the hallway. Above it. The attic. It's strange how your body decides what to do before your brain catches up. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I just started moving toward the stairs like I'd been given an order I couldn't refuse. The house was dead quiet except for the creak of the steps above me. Whoever was up there was in no rush. Halfway up, I stopped. My hand was on the banister, my ears straining. The footsteps stopped too, like they'd been waiting for me to get into position. I backed down, slow. My phone was already in my hand. I called 911. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to when I said, "Someone's in my attic." They told me to wait outside. I stepped onto the porch, keeping my eyes on both the attic window and the station wagon. But the driveway was empty now. The car was gone. 2 officers arrived within minutes. They went up into the attic while I stood on the lawn with one of them. Nothing. No person, no footprints in the dust, no forced entry. The box wasn't there either. They asked if I was sure I hadn't moved it myself. I said no. They asked if maybe a family member had come by earlier. I said definitely no. One of them gave me the kind of look people reserve for folks they think are stressed to the point of imagining things. They left me with a reminder to keep my doors locked. The house was quiet again after they left, but it didn't feel empty. That's the part I still can't explain. A week later, my dad called from the care home. His voice was shaky, not from the stroke this time, but something else. "Did you open it?" he asked. "No," I said. "Good," he whispered. There was a long pause before he added, "Back. Then don't answer if it comes." For the first few days after my dad's warning, I treated the house like it was under siege. Every door was locked, every window latched. I even bought a cheap motion sensor light for the attic hatch. It went off the second night. I didn't go up there. I didn't even check the hallway. I just sat in the living room with every lamp on, staring at the ceiling until morning. The more I thought about the box, the more I realized how little I knew. My dad had always kept parts of his life walled off. There were things from his military years he never discussed. Missions, names, places. I'd assumed the "Do Not Open" label was just him being sentimental or paranoid. Now I wasn't so sure. On the 6th night, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but something sliding, heavy across the attic floor. I didn't call the police. The last visit had left me feeling like a child making up ghost stories. Instead, I grabbed my keys and walked out the front door without looking back. I drove aimlessly for over an hour, the whole time checking my rearview mirror for a rusty blue station wagon. When I finally came home, it was close to midnight. The motion light above the attic was still on. In the morning, I found a box on the porch. Not the same one. This one was smaller, newer, taped shut. No note, just my name written on the top in that same block lettering from the attic. I didn't bring it inside. I didn't even touch it. I drove straight to the dump and left it there, tape unbroken. That afternoon, my dad called again. I didn't tell him about the new box, I just said, "Come back." He let out a long, shaky breath. It hasn't. We didn't talk about it again. The house sold 2 months later. I didn't tell the buyers about the attic. I told myself it wasn't my story to share anymore. Still, sometimes I'll be walking to my car at night and see a box sitting on a porch somewhere down the street. Never mine, but close enough to notice. And I think about the woman in the windbreaker, the man with the sunglasses, the empty space in the attic, and my dad's voice saying, "Don't answer if it comes back." I've kept that promise. Some things in life aren't meant to be opened, not because they hide treasure, but because they hide truths we're not ready or willing to carry. Curiosity can lead you to knowledge, but it can also open doors that can never be shut again. I never thought a yard sale could be the start of something I'd carry in the pit of my stomach for the rest of my life. It was the summer of 2023, the kind of summer that already felt heavy before the heat even set in. I'd lost my job in June, budget cuts, they said. And though I walked out of that office with my head high, the reality hit hard when the bills started coming due. Rent, utilities, car payment, they stacked up like bricks on my chest. I've never been the kind to ask for help. Not from family, not from friends. That stubborn streak is probably what had me pacing my living room one humid Thursday night, staring at the old couch in the corner, the stack of electronics gathering dust in the hall closet, and thinking, maybe someone else could use this stuff. The idea of a yard sale came slowly, the way a storm creeps in from the horizon. The next 2 days, I turned my small house into a staging area, folding tables from the basement, cardboard boxes emptied, old picture frames wiped down. I priced everything with masking tape and a black marker, my grandmother's coffee percolator, a stack of novels I'd been meaning to read, a nearly new toaster I never liked. The biggest ticket item was an old DSLR camera, a gift from a short-lived relationship, worth far more than I was asking. $60 seemed fair. That Sunday, August 20th, the air felt thick enough to drink. By 7:30 a.m., I had the tables set up across the lawn, each item arranged neatly as though order could keep the day from feeling desperate. Early customers wandered in. An older couple bought a set of mismatched silverware. A teenager with a skateboard left with a box of vinyl records. 2 moms browsed kids' toys with that tired but determined look I knew well. It was normal, comfortably normal. Then, around 9 a.m., I saw him. Mid-40s, sunburned cheeks, baseball cap pulled low, a t-shirt with the sleeves cut off like he'd taken scissors to it that morning. He had the walk of a man who didn't believe in wasting steps. No browsing, no small talk. He went straight to the table with the electronics and picked up the camera. "How much?" he asked. His voice was low but carried a weight to it, like he was used to getting answers quick. "60, I said, wiping my palms on my shorts. He dug in his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $100 bill and held it between 2 fingers. "Only got 100. "I don't have enough change yet," I told him. "If you come back in an hour, I should be able to..." "I'm not walking away from this, it's mine now," he said, turning as if that settled it. I stepped in front of him, the camera still in his hand. "Sir, I need to give you your change first." He stopped, stared at me long enough for the silence to turn heavy. Then he muttered, "Get robbed at yard sales all the time. Watch yourself. People." And just like that, he set the bill on the table and walked away, without the camera, without the money. I stood there holding both, my stomach buzzing in a way that wasn't relief. I had no idea that was only the start. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird encounter with a guy who didn't know how yard sales worked. But by noon, I spotted his beat-up Chevy parked down the street. Same faded blue, same dent in the front fender. He wasn't browsing any other sales. He was just sitting there. I kept busy with customers. A woman bought the percolator. A man in overalls haggled for the garden tools. But every so often I'd catch sight of that Chevy again. Sometimes at the corner, sometimes closer. Around 1:15, I was making change for a young couple when I noticed a folded slip of paper wedged under the corner of my cash box. I hadn't seen who put it there. I unfolded it with my thumb, the handwriting sharp and messy. "You owe me." My hands went cold. I shoved the note in my pocket, not wanting anyone else to see it. From then on, the day crawled. Every car that slowed in front of the house made my chest tighten. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, but the Chevy kept showing up, disappearing, then showing up again like it was playing a game. By 5 p.m., most of the crowd was gone. The sky had that tired golden hue it gets before sunset. I was folding up a table when I realized my phone, which I'd been keeping near the cash box, was gone. My stomach dropped. I ran inside, scanning the kitchen counter, the living room coffee table. And then I saw it. Sitting dead center on the counter was the DSLR camera, the same one I hadn't sold him. I'd left it outside. The doors were locked. No windows broken. My house was small enough that I would have heard if someone came in, but there it was. My first thought wasn't theft anymore. It was intrusion. The Chevy didn't show again until later, but that camera sitting on my counter, that was enough to make the shadows in my own house feel heavier. By the time the sun dipped low and the yard was stripped bare of anything worth selling, I was running on stale coffee and frayed nerves. I'd managed to shove everything inside and triple-check the locks, but the image of that camera sitting on my kitchen counter kept replaying in my head like a bad loop. At 7:40 p.m., the landline rang. Hardly anyone ever called it. I kept it mostly for emergencies, but the shrill sound filled the house like an alarm. "Hello?" I said, my voice tighter than I meant. A man's voice came through, calm, too calm. "We're even now, but you still have my change." There was no background noise, no hesitation, just the statement. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, the receiver warm against my ear, listening to the dial tone. Even now, I couldn't say why I didn't call the police then. Maybe because he hadn't made an explicit threat. Maybe because a part of me didn't think they'd take it seriously. But the truth is, I was already too far into a state of dread to think clearly. As night closed in, I went from room to room, checking windows, peering out at the street. At 9:40 p.m., the darkness outside my bedroom window bloomed with light for just a second, the sweep of headlights. I crept to the blinds and pulled them back just enough to see. The Chevy was idling right in front of my house, lights off now. The silhouette of a man sat motionless behind the wheel. I watched for 30 seconds, maybe longer. He didn't move. That finally jolted me into action. I called the police, my voice sharper than I'd heard it all day. They said they'd send someone, and by the time the cruiser rolled into view, the Chevy was gone. The officer who came to the door was polite, but leaned on the word vague a lot. "No direct, no property damage. We can log it, keep an eye out, but..." He left the rest threat, he said. Unsaid. When I went to bed that night, I kept a baseball bat propped against the nightstand. Sleep wasn't so much sleep as brief, shallow dozes interrupted by every creak in the house. Morning light did nothing to ease the knot in my stomach. I brewed coffee, but my hands were shaking so badly I spilled half the grounds. It wasn't just fear. It was the knowledge that whoever he was, he'd been in my house without my knowing. I opened the front door to grab the paper, and that's when I saw it. Taped to the center of the door was my phone. The screen was spider-webbed with cracks, like it had been dropped from a height. Tucked behind it was a folded stack of bills. 2 20s. $40. The absurdity of it hit me hard. This man had returned my phone. paid me back, as if we were settling some bizarre tab. It made no sense, and the fact that it made no sense made it worse. I didn't touch either right away. I just stood there staring at them, feeling like I was looking at bait on a hook. Finally, I peeled the tape off, set the phone and cash inside, and locked the door again. I didn't know what he was trying to say, if this was his way of closing whatever he thought existed between us, or if it was the prelude to something else. That day, I called my sister 2 states over and told her I might come visit for a while. She heard something in my voice that kept her from asking too many questions. I spent the rest of that week glancing over my shoulder, checking the street before stepping outside. Every time an old Chevy passed, my pulse jumped. I'd like to tell you it stopped after that the phone and the cash were the end. But fear has a way of lingering, even when the threat disappears. It stains everything it touches. I didn't pack for my sisters that day. I told myself I'd wait, see if things stayed quiet. Maybe it was really over. A weird weekend encounter that had finally burned itself out. For 3 days there was nothing. No Chevy, no calls, no notes. I even managed to sleep without the bat by the bed. On the 4th day, I convinced myself it was safe enough to mow the lawn. The late August sun was already pressing heat down in thick layers, and I kept my headphones in, music turned low so I could still hear the street. Halfway through trimming the front yard, I saw him. He was standing across the street, no Chevy in sight, no hat, no smirk, just standing, arms crossed, watching. I stopped the mower. We stared at each other for a long, tight moment before he spoke, his voice carrying easily over the quiet street. "You didn't count it." It took me a beat to realize he meant the $40. My skin went cold. "I'm not interested in anything else you've got," I called back, trying to keep my voice even. He smiled. "That's good, because I'm not interested in buying anymore." Then he walked away. Not toward a car, not toward a house, just down the street until he turned the corner. I didn't wait this time. By the end of the week, I'd rented a storage unit for the yard sale leftovers, put my camera in a sealed box, and listed my house with a local agent. Within a month, I was gone. The Chevy never came back. I never saw him again. But even now, whenever I'm at a stoplight and an old, dented car pulls up beside me, I feel the same jolt in my chest that I did that summer morning. I don't hold yard sales anymore. I don't post my address online for anything. And I don't underestimate people just because the setting seems harmless. Because here's the thing. The worst danger doesn't always come with shouting or threats or even weapons. Sometimes it comes quiet, wearing the face of an ordinary man at an ordinary table on an ordinary Sunday morning. You can't control how strangers will act, but you can control how much access you give them to your life. Safety isn't paranoia, it's preparation. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if it seems small, because the cost of ignoring that gut feeling can be far greater than the value of anything you might gain. When I moved to Greenford, I thought I was done with surprises. I wanted a life quiet enough that the days would blur together. Work, home, maybe the occasional grocery run. No more big risks, no more broken hearts. After the breakup 6 months earlier, I'd promised myself that. It had ended badly enough that even the smallest gestures, a hand on my back, a text that said, "Thinking of you," felt dangerous. The house I'd found was a small rental tucked at the end of Maplewood Terrace. One story, yellow siding, the kind of front porch you could sit on for hours with a cup of coffee. I liked that no one knew me there. I could walk to the market, wave at neighbors without learning their names, and keep my history sealed away in a dozen taped-up boxes I hadn't bothered to open since moving. Then my landlord mentioned the community yard sale. "It's good for meeting folks," she said, like that was a selling point. I tried to beg off, but she reminded me that part of the lease agreement encouraged participation in neighborhood events. I'd never even heard of such a clause, but she smiled as if it were set in stone. So that Saturday, I was out front by 8, dragging folding tables under the big maple tree. The air was crisp, with that faint sweetness that comes only in October when the leaves have just begun to rot and the sunlight has more gold than heat. I told myself it would be business only. I'd unload some kitchenware, the stack of hardcovers my ex had left, maybe a few vintage cameras that had belonged to my dad, but were now collecting dust. It was quiet at first, a couple buying a chipped teapot, a man with a dog sniffing at my table of cookbooks. Around 9:30, he appeared. Tall, dark hair, navy sweater over jeans that looked like they'd been worn in, not bought that way. He had one of those open, steady smiles that makes you feel like you're the only person on the street. His eyes landed on the cameras, and he walked over slowly, almost reverently. "These yours?" he asked. "They were my dad's," I said. He picked one up like it was breakable glass. "Just store them away. These deserve someone who'll use them. Not we talked, not small talk, but the kind that skips over weather and traffic and goes straight to things you might miss later." He told me his name was Evan. He knew the coast, the trails, the coffee shops that weren't tourist traps. He spoke like he'd lived here forever, but never tired of it. 20 minutes later, he bought one of the cameras. As he left, he said, "Can still do." It sounded like a promise. "I'll show you what I didn't think much of it until later." The rest of the day went like any other yard sale. People came and went. A woman tried to haggle a $3 lamp down to $1. Kids darted between tables, sticky with cider donuts from somewhere up the street. It wasn't until I was folding up the last table around 5 that I saw him again. Evan. He wasn't walking up to the house this time. He was across the street, leaning against a lamppost. When I waved, he didn't wave back. Just watched. Not with malice exactly, but with the kind of stillness that felt deliberate. By the time I carried the last box inside, he was gone. I shook it off, probably just passing through. That night, around 8:30, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. The message read, "I think I left something in the camera bag." It was signed E. I unzipped the bag where I'd tucked the camera's case after he left. Inside, I found something I hadn't seen before. A photo print, black and white, crisp focus. It was me, standing at my own yard sale that morning, head turned toward another customer, completely unaware someone was taking the picture. I stared at it for a long time before putting it back in the bag. I didn't reply to the message. I didn't know what to say. The next morning, sunlight slid in through the front curtains and I padded into the kitchen for coffee. When I opened the front door to grab the paper, my stomach dropped. Evan was sitting on my front steps. He looked up and smiled like we'd known each other for years. Paper bag and a cardboard tray with 2 cups. Lonely yesterday. "Morning," he said, holding up a "thought I'd bring breakfast. You seemed..." I froze in the doorway. "How did you know where I live?" His eyebrows lifted in mock confusion. "I was just here yesterday, for the sale." It was a fair point, but something about the way he said it, like it was the most natural thing in the world to come back uninvited, set my teeth on edge. I let him hand me one of the coffees, telling myself it was easier than making a scene. We sat on the porch while he talked about a photography project he was starting. I nodded in the right places, but every time his eyes lingered a little too long, my pulse ticked faster. When he asked if I wanted to see some of his work, I mumbled something about having a busy day ahead. He smiled again, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. By late afternoon, I'd carried the last of the unsold boxes inside. I was halfway through stacking them in the hall closet when Evan appeared in the doorway. "I can help," he said. I startled so hard I nearly dropped a box. "I didn't hear you knock." "I didn't," he said. I told him I didn't need help. He didn't move, just took a slow step forward. He said, his voice low, almost casual, like we'd already agreed on something. "I don't mind waiting." I stood frozen until he finally stepped back, the door behind him. "Another time then," he said, and left without closing. That evening, I kept the porch light on, curtains drawn. Around 10, I peeked through a slit in the living room drapes. Across the street, under the maple tree, a dark figure stood still. I watched for an hour. He didn't leave. By Sunday morning, I knew I couldn't stay in the house that night. I packed a small bag, told myself I'd check into a motel. When I opened the door to leave, there was a photo lying on the porch. Another one of me from the yard sale, this time looking straight into the camera. No message. I didn't go back that night, or the next. I never saw him again. But every time I walk down Maplewood Terrace, I glance at the maple tree, half expecting to see him there. Some days, a part of me, the part I hate, wonders what would have happened if I'd let him carry those boxes in, if I'd said yes to coffee again. But I know better. Attention can feel flattering, especially when you've been lonely, but not all attention is safe. Trusting your instincts is more important than avoiding offense, because the wrong person can turn an ordinary moment into something you carry with you for years. If you've ever gone through a divorce in your family, you know it's not just the people who split. The world splits with them. Walls change, rooms change, and the air itself feels different. 6 months earlier, my parents' marriage had blown apart in spectacular, ugly fashion. My older brother Ethan and I had ended up together in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Maplewood Heights, Oregon. It was the kind of place where the carpet never looked clean, no matter how hard you scrubbed, and the neighbors always seemed to be arguing just out of sight. We were both working too much, him at a car parts warehouse, me at a diner, trying to keep rent paid and the fridge stocked. Most of my belongings were still in boxes stacked against my bedroom wall. I kept telling myself I'd unpack once things settled, but in my heart I knew settled was a fantasy. On that humid Saturday morning in June, I was restless. The air was heavy, the kind of sticky warmth that made the ceiling fans feel useless. I decided a walk might clear my head. That's when I saw the sign. It was nothing more than cardboard on a wooden stake, the black marker bleeding slightly into the fibers. Yard sale. Everything must go. An arrow pointed left toward Cedar Lane. I followed. The yard sale was squeezed between 2 houses with overgrown lawns. Boxes were spilling onto the cracked sidewalk, some marked "free" in fading red ink. A few mismatched chairs sat crooked in the grass. But what caught my eye was the trunk. It was antique, wooden, the carvings worn almost smooth by time. My grandmother had owned something similar. Hers smelled of cedar and old wool blankets. I felt a pull toward it, like an echo of something familiar. The woman running the sale was in her 70s, wiry but graceful, her white hair coiled into a bun. She smiled politely but kept glancing over her shoulder toward the attic window of the house behind her. "This yours?" I asked, nodding toward the trunk. Her hand hesitated on the edge of the table, our better left untouched. "It's not really for sale," she said. Something in her tone made me pause. But the trunk was exactly the kind of thing our apartment needed. A piece with history, not the particle board shelves we'd been making do with. I asked again, pressing gently, and after a moment she shrugged. I gave her $10. Her fingers trembled when she took the bills. "Be careful with it," she murmured. I told myself she was just sentimental. I didn't know yet that she was giving me more than an object. Back at the apartment, Ethan was stretched on the couch, half asleep with the TV murmuring some car restoration show. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, eyeing the trunk as I dragged it in. "Yard sale. $10, I said. He smirked. "Hope it's not full of spiders." We set it against the wall in my room. That evening after dinner, I couldn't resist opening it. The hinges groaned like something waking up after a long sleep. Inside were stacks of old photographs, letters browned at the edges, and a small music box with inlaid mother of pearl. When I wound the box, a soft, delicate tune began to play, but there was something beneath it. At first I thought it was static, but the longer I listened, the more it sounded like whispers. I couldn't make out words, just the tone. Low, urgent, almost pleading. The shadows in my room seemed longer than they should have been, reaching toward the trunk. A chill slid through the humid air. I shook it off, blaming exhaustion and the stress of the past year. Over the next few days, small things began to happen. The music box would play when I hadn't touched it. I'd hear faint laughter, quick and light, even when I was alone. Sometimes in the hallway outside my door, there'd be movement, a flicker in my peripheral vision, and when I turned, nothing. One night I Googled Callahan Trunk, Oregon, the name from the old envelopes in the box. Buried among genealogy pages and estate auction listings was a thread from a local forum, a trunk linked to incidents in the 1970s. No details, just rumors about disappearances in the Cedar Lane neighborhood. I shut the laptop. It was ridiculous. Old furniture didn't carry ghosts. But I didn't sleep well that night. It was Wednesday when the attic footsteps started. We didn't have an attic. Our building was 3 floors and we were on the top. Above us was only roof. But that afternoon, as I folded laundry in my room, I heard slow, deliberate steps overhead, boards creaking under weight. "Ethan?" I called. He leaned in from the hallway. "What? You hear that?" He frowned, listened, then shook his head. "You're jumpy. Lay off the horror movies." That night, I woke to the music box again. The tune was slower this time, dragging like it was being pulled underwater. Whispers filled the space between notes, angry now and close. When I switched on the lamp, the trunk's lid was open. I hadn't left it that way. I shut it, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. By Friday, I'd decided the only thing that made sense was to return it. I told Ethan, but he just shrugged. "If it creeps you out, fine, but you're wasting $10. We walked back to 1428 Cedar Lane that evening. The sun was dipping low, painting the street in amber light. But when we turned the corner, my steps slowed. The house was gone. Not empty, gone. In its place was a freshly mulched lot, a narrow driveway leading to nothing. No boxes, no tables, no Mrs. Callahan. It looked like no one had lived there in years. "Wrong street?" Ethan asked. "No," I said, my throat dry. "It was here." We stood there until the streetlights buzzed on. Then we went home, the trunk still sitting in my room. Weeks have passed. I've tried to ignore it, to treat it like any other piece of furniture. But sometimes, late at night, the music drifts through the apartment again. I don't always know if it's coming from my room or somewhere else. The shadows still move wrong, and when I pass my window, I feel watched, not by someone outside, but by something waiting for me to look. I keep the trunk closed now. A blanket thrown over it like that will make a difference. But deep down, I know whatever was in that attic, wherever that attic was, is here with me now. Some curiosities aren't worth satisfying. History doesn't always want to be uncovered, and not every story is yours to finish. When something feels wrong, listen, because the past has a way of following you home. There's something about the quiet parts of a city that feels heavier than the noise. When the traffic fades and the sidewalks empty, every creak, every shadow takes on a different kind of meaning. I'd been living in the Riverside Park neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio for just under 4 months, and I was still trying to get used to that kind of quiet. After graduating the year before, I'd landed a job at a small marketing firm downtown. It was nothing glamorous, emails, ad copy, endless coffee runs, but it paid my rent on a shoebox-sized studio and kept me from moving back in with my parents. The routine was relentless. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. My life had all the color of wet cardboard. Saturday mornings became my escape. I'd wander the neighborhood looking for anything that might shake me out of my autopilot existence. Farmers markets, pop-up art fairs, yard sales. That's how I found the sign. It was bright orange, the kind of color you couldn't miss even half a block away. The letters read, "Yard Sale, Rare Items," followed by an address I didn't recognize, 27 Elm Street. I'd never walked that far into the neighborhood, but I had time and nothing better to do. The street was narrow, lined with maple trees and a few small, older homes set back from the curb. 27. Elm was tucked behind a row of brick townhouses, almost like it was hiding. The yard sale was strange. Not cluttered, not messy. Every item was placed deliberately on folding tables or shelves, rows of vinyl records, old hardcovers, bits of jewelry. And then there was the doll. She sat alone on a wooden crate, porcelain skin dulled by dust, her once white dress torn at the hem. Her blue glass eyes seemed fixed on me, sharp and unblinking. The man running the sale was older, with silver hair and a sharpness in his gaze that didn't soften when he smiled. He noticed where my attention had gone. "Careful with her," he said quietly. "She's special. Some people don't take her lightly." I tried to laugh it off. "Special how?" He didn't answer, just turned and began rearranging a stack of records. I should have walked away, but I'd been craving something unusual, something to break the monotony. "How much?" I asked. He hesitated, then held up 10 fingers. $10. When he handed me the doll, I felt the coldness of the porcelain against my palms. Oddly cold, given the warmth of the September morning. On the walk home, the streets felt unusually empty. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, certain that someone was following. But there was never anyone there. I set the doll on my kitchen counter when I got back. The plan was to clean her up the next morning, wipe away the dust, maybe stitch the tear in her dress. She didn't exactly fit with my decor, but I told myself she'd be a quirky conversation piece. That night I stayed up later than usual, scrolling through my phone with the TV on in the background. Around 11:30 I heard it, a faint, drawn-out creak, the kind of sound wood makes when weight shifts on it. My apartment wasn't big, and I knew the noise came from the kitchen. When I looked, the doll was no longer facing forward. She was turned toward the doorway, her glass eyes angled directly at me. My stomach tightened. I hadn't touched her. I stood there for a long moment, frozen. Finally, I laughed, too loud, too quick, and told myself I'd just placed her differently without realizing it. Stress, lack of sleep, whatever. I turned her back and went to bed. The next morning, she was sitting on the far edge of the counter, turned slightly toward the living room. By Wednesday, I'd stopped trying to explain it. Every day she was somewhere else, on the windowsill, on the arm of my couch, once even on my desk when I came home from work, always facing me. The thing that really unsettled me wasn't the movement, it was the feeling that came with it. A prickling at the back of my neck, like the air was being watched. I stopped inviting people over. I didn't want anyone seeing her, didn't want to explain why a doll kept appearing in different places like some sick game of hide and seek. My work performance slipped. I was tired all the time, my mind wrapped around the problem of what was happening in my own apartment. The dreams started next. In them, I'd be lying in bed, and I could hear the soft patter of feet across the floor, tiny, deliberate. The doll would appear beside my bed, her mouth moving in whispers I couldn't understand. The words were always just out of reach, but the tone was urgent, angry. One rainy Thursday, I decided I needed answers. I found the crumpled yard sale flyer in my coat pocket and called the number printed on it. After several rings, a gravelly voice answered. "Mr. Whitaker?" I asked. Silence. "I bought a doll from you," I said. I think there's something wrong with it." The line went dead. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I decided to go back to 27 Elm Street in person. The house was nothing like I remembered. The neatly kept yard was gone. The windows were boarded up, the paint peeled and weathered. The porch sagged as if it had been left to rot for years. I knocked anyway. No answer. A neighbor stepped out onto her porch across the street. "You looking for someone?" she called. "Yeah, Mr. Whitaker, the man who lives here." She frowned. 2009. No one's lived there since, at least 15 years. Old man Whitaker died, and the chill that went through me wasn't from the wind. I moved apartments 2 months later, convincing myself a fresh space would fix things. It didn't. The doll came with me. I told myself I couldn't just throw her away, that it was just porcelain and cloth, that whatever I thought I'd experienced was stress and coincidence. But some nights, I wake to faint laughter in the dark, or a whisper that seems to come from just inside my ear. The air turns cold and I feel the weight of those glass eyes even when I keep mine closed. I've stopped looking directly at her. It feels like a dare I'd lose. She's still here, always facing me, always watching. Some things are better left where you found them. Curiosity can blur into invitation, and not every presence that follows you home means you well. Some mornings feel heavier than others, like the air itself has something to say if you just stand still long enough to hear it. That Sunday morning in early July had that kind of weight. The neighborhood was still waking up, sprinklers clicking, a dog barking in the distance, the smell of someone's bacon drifting across the street. I had no real destination when I stepped outside. The past year had been one long, uneven road. Sophie and I had made the choice to downsize, swapping our cramped, noisy apartment in the city for a modest 2-story townhouse in Willow Creek. It should have been a fresh start. Instead, it felt like an escape we weren't ready to admit to ourselves. Sophie was still reeling from losing her job. I was learning to live with the jittery aftershocks of a car accident that had left me with bruises that healed faster than my nerves. I walked to get away from my own head. A few blocks from home, I spotted the sign taped to a leaning lamppost. Yard sale, rare treasures. Scrawled in big block letters, an arrow pointing down Magnolia Drive. I'd been to plenty of yard sales in my life. Most were just card tables of unwanted clothes and mismatched mugs. But something about the phrase rare treasures hooked me. The sale was already busy. People milled around, picking through books, antique lamps, and boxes of kitchenware. I wandered between tables, half interested, until I noticed something half hidden under a table piled with faded quilts. It was a wooden chest, the kind you'd expect to see at the foot of someone's bed a century ago. Its surface was scuffed and scarred, the dark varnish worn down to bare wood in places. The brass lock was mottled with rust, and the keyhole stared back at me like an unblinking eye. I crouched down for a closer look, running my fingers over the grain. That's when the woman behind the table, short, gray-haired, wearing an apron over a faded floral dress, stepped closer. "Not sure that's something you'd want," she said. "Is it for sale?" I asked. She hesitated. "It's better if it stays closed." Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. I gave her a small smile. "I was thinking I could restore it, maybe use it as a coffee table." Her gaze lingered on me a moment longer. Then she sighed. "If you insist, $20. I paid without haggling. When I lifted the chest, I was surprised by the weight. It felt far heavier than it should have, as though it carried more than just wood and metal. The walk home felt different, as if every sound, every rustle of leaves, every passing car was sharper, closer. Sophie was sitting on the couch when I carried it in, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. "What's that?" she asked. "Found it at a yard sale," I said. "Thought I'd clean it up." She raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. That night after dinner, we decided to see what was inside. It took us a while to work the lock open. I tried a couple of old keys I had in a drawer, none of which fit. In the end, Sophie wedged a screwdriver into the keyhole and twisted until the rusted latch gave with a reluctant click. The lid creaked as I lifted it, and a cool draft seemed to rise from the dark inside. "Did you feel that?" Sophie asked. I nodded, though I couldn't explain it. Inside was a stack of envelopes tied with fraying twine, a handful of black and white photographs curled at the edges, and a folded piece of parchment-like paper that turned out to be a map. The letters were written in cramped, hurried handwriting, the kind you see when someone's writing faster than their thoughts can form. The first one I opened began without greeting, just straight into a plea. "Do not ignore what's in the walls. It waits and it watches. Never stay in the dark alone." I skimmed through a few more. They were all the same, half warnings, half confessions. One mentioned betrayal, another spoke of something that moved when the house was still. Sophie frowned as she sifted through the photographs. Most were of a single house, the same one from different angles. In every shot, the windows seemed dark, the curtains drawn. "This is creepy," she said, tossing them back into the chest. We studied the map together. It was hand-drawn, with the street names written in old-fashioned cursive. Our neighborhood wasn't on it, but I could see where Willow Creek would be now. A small X was marked in the attic of one house. We put everything back and closed the chest. I told myself it was just an old box with some eccentric contents. But that night, as we settled into bed, I heard the faint creak of footsteps on the stairs. At first, I thought Sophie had gotten up for water, but when I turned, she was beside me, sound asleep. The noise came again. 2 deliberate steps, then silence. The next morning, Sophie said she'd seen a shadow in the hallway just before bed. Said, like someone standing there watching. Tall. We laughed it off at breakfast, but neither of us finished our coffee. The following days carried a strange edge to them, the kind that you can't quite name but feel in the pit of your stomach. We tried to keep life normal. Sophie looked for jobs online. I worked remotely from the kitchen table. The chest sat in the corner of the living room like an uninvited guest neither of us wanted to acknowledge. On Wednesday night, I came downstairs to get a glass of water. The house was quiet, but the air felt colder than it should. I glanced toward the corner. The chest's lid was open by an inch. I froze. I was certain we had closed it. I leaned over and pushed it shut, telling myself Sophie might have been looking through it earlier. But the next morning she asked why I'd been going through the chest in the middle of the night. "I didn't," I said. Her expression tightened. "Then how was it open?" We let the conversation die there, but the unease lingered. 2 nights later, we were sitting on the couch when a dull thump sounded from upstairs. Sophie's eyes met mine instantly. "That came from the attic," she whispered. Our townhouse had an attic space accessible through a hatch in the hallway ceiling. We rarely went up there, mostly because there was nothing in it but insulation and dust. I grabbed the stepladder and climbed up. The air in the attic was stale, dry, and faintly metallic. I swept my flashlight across the beams and insulation. That's when I saw it. A narrow wooden panel along the far wall that didn't match the rest of the attic's plywood. Curiosity outweighed caution. I pried it open, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside were more letters wrapped in oilcloth and a small tin box with a broken clasp. I pulled them out and climbed back down. We sat at the kitchen table and unwrapped the letters. They were older than the ones in the chest. Same frantic handwriting, but faded almost to illegibility. Several mentioned a name, Daniel Cormack, followed by phrases like, "He knows where it hides," and "He sealed it, but not well enough." The tin box held a single brass key. It was small, ornate, and heavy for its size. We turned it over in our hands, wondering if it belonged to the chest, but the keyhole on the chest was too wide for it. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the creak of the attic hatch shifting slightly as if something on the other side was testing it. By Friday, the atmosphere in the house had shifted entirely. Little things piled up. Doors that we were sure we'd closed standing slightly ajar, the faint sound of whispering in empty rooms. Cold spots in the hallway that made you catch your breath. Sophie began having vivid dreams. She'd wake up with her heart racing, claiming she'd seen the chest in her sleep. But in the dream, it was in a different place each time. A school, a church, a deserted stretch of road. Always closed, but always waiting. One afternoon, I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house at 3429 Magnolia Drive. Online property records showed it had belonged to the Daniels family for over 60 years. Before that, it was part of a larger estate that had been subdivided. I found no mention of Daniel Cormack, but when I searched his name alone, an old local news article surfaced from 1974. The article was brief, about a man found dead in his home under unexplained circumstances. His body had been discovered in the attic by neighbors after strange smells and sounds were reported. There was no follow-up, no explanation. That evening, I told Sophie what I'd found. She didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she said, "Think we should get rid of the chest." I wanted to agree, but part of me resisted. The mystery had its hooks in me. It wasn't just about the chest anymore. It was about what tied it to the attic, to those letters, to the faint feeling that someone else was living in our house with us. At around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of something sliding across the floor downstairs. I crept down in the dark, my hand trailing the banister. The chest was no longer in the corner. It was sitting in the middle of the living room. Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, her voice shaking. "Why did you move it?" "I didn't," I said. We stood there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. The chest sat between us and the front door, as if blocking the way out. The next morning, neither of us spoke much. The coffee tasted flat, the sunlight through the blinds felt muted, and even the sound of passing cars seemed distant. The chest remained in the middle of the living room like it belonged there. I kept telling myself it was just an object. Wood and metal couldn't move on its own. But I didn't believe it. By noon, Sophie had packed a duffel bag, chasing whatever this is. But I'm done. "I'm staying at my sister's," she said. "You can keep," I wanted to argue, to convince her we could figure it out together, but my throat tightened. I let her go. Watching her walk out the door left a heavier weight than the chest ever could. That evening, I sat in the living room with the letters spread across the coffee table. The brass key sat beside them, cold against my palm. I turned it over, feeling its grooves. On impulse, I lifted the chest's lid again. The cold hit me instantly, sharper this time. I dug through the contents, photographs, letters, the folded map, until I found a false bottom I hadn't noticed before. It came up with a faint pop, revealing a small lockbox. The brass key slid into its lock perfectly. Inside were more letters, but these were different. The handwriting was neater, almost resigned. They spoke of keeping the thing contained and warning anyone who finds this to resist opening it. The final letter ended mid-sentence, ink smeared as if the writer had been interrupted. The room seemed darker even though the lamps were on. My ears rang with a low hum, like a faraway engine. I put the false bottom back in place, closed the lid, and stepped away. That night I dreamt of a man standing in the corner of my bedroom. I couldn't see his face, but I knew his name. When I woke, my mouth was dry and the chest was at the foot of my bed. 2 days later, I rented a storage unit on the far side of town. I didn't tell Sophie. I didn't tell anyone. I moved the chest there and left it in the farthest corner. Driving away, I expected to feel lighter, but I didn't. The townhouse was quieter afterward, but every so often, late at night, I still hear faint creaks in the hallway. And I know that if I ever go back to that storage unit, the chest won't be where I left it. Some mysteries promise answers but carry only weight. Curiosity can feel like a harmless pull, but it can root itself in your life until it takes more than you bargained for. Not every locked thing is meant to be opened, and sometimes walking away is the only way to keep what matters from slipping away. Small towns have a way of stretching time. The days in Brookfield Hollow drifted by slow enough that you noticed the leaves changing one shade at a time. The mornings smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. After living in Boston for most of my adult life, I thought the quiet would help me get my head back on straight. But a year into staying at my Uncle Mark's place, the stillness had started to feel more like a waiting room than a retreat. When I first arrived, I told myself it was temporary. I'd bounce back quickly, find a new job, move out, start over. Instead, my resume sat untouched in a folder on my laptop, and my bank account kept shrinking. I picked up odd jobs here and there, helping a neighbor repair his porch, running errands for an elderly woman down the road. But mostly I lingered. Yard sales became my weekend habit. They were a mix of necessity and escape. I couldn't afford to buy much, but there was something comforting about walking through someone else's memories. An old clock, a faded quilt, a stack of Polaroids, Objects that once mattered to someone, now waiting to be picked up by another pair of hands. That Saturday morning was bright but cool. The air carried a sharpness that hinted at the first frost of the season. Uncle Mark had gone fishing with a buddy, so I had the day to myself. I spotted the sign by chance, a piece of cardboard nailed to a fence post. Yard sale, vintage goods in thick black marker, with an arrow pointing down a gravel drive. The driveway was long and curved, opening into a yard scattered with folding tables. A woman, maybe in her late 40s, stood near the far table arranging a row of typewriters. She gave me a polite nod but didn't call out. Her name, I'd later learn, was Teresa. I moved slowly through the tables, old clocks with frozen hands, chipped mugs, boxes of dog-eared books. It was the kind of sale where you knew most of the items had been in one family for generations. That's when I saw it. A vintage Polaroid camera, half hidden on a low shelf beneath a stack of novels. The leather strap was cracked, the edges scuffed, but the body was solid, the kind of weight that makes you think it could survive being dropped down a flight of stairs. I picked it up, feeling that strange, almost magnetic pull you get when an object feels like it's meant to be yours. "Does it work?" I asked. Teresa hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the camera before returning to the typewriters. "Works," she said softly, "in its own way." Her answer was vague enough to feel rehearsed, like she'd said it before. I waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. I handed her a few bills and she placed the camera in a paper bag. No small talk, no story about where it came from. Just a faint closed-mouth smile as I left. I walked home with the camera swinging from its strap, not realizing yet that I wasn't carrying just a piece of machinery, but a piece of something else entirely. Back at my uncle's place, I set the camera on the kitchen table and hunted through the drawers for the pack of Polaroid film I knew I had from a flea market months ago. The film had probably expired years ago, but I figured it was worth a shot. Uncle Mark's kitchen was small and warm with low sunlight spilling through the curtains. I aimed the camera at the far wall, pressed the shutter, and the machine came to life with a deep, mechanical whir. The photo slid out with a faint chemical smell. I laid it on the table to develop. When the image finally came into focus, my stomach tightened. It wasn't the empty kitchen I'd aimed at. A young boy stood by the window, his hands tucked into the pockets of old-fashioned trousers, a white shirt buttoned to the collar. His hair was neatly combed, and his expression was unreadable. There had been no one in the kitchen. I'd been alone. I told myself it was some kind of double exposure. Maybe an old image burned into the film from whoever owned the camera before, but the unease sat heavy in my chest. I took another photo, this time outside, aiming at the porch. When the picture developed, it showed my uncle sitting in his old rocker, cigarette in hand. The detail was sharp, the smoke curling upward, the deep lines in his face. But what struck me was the age of him. He looked younger, much younger, and my uncle hadn't smoked in over a decade. When Mark came home that evening, I showed him the photos. His expression went stiff. "That's not possible," he muttered, handing them back without looking me in the eye. "What do you think it means?" I asked. He shook his head and busied himself unloading his fishing gear. Some things aren't meant to be messed with. "It means you should get rid of..." I laughed it off at the time, but later that night when the house was dark and quiet, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table again, the camera in front of me. My fingers itched to take another photo. And that's when I realized I wasn't curious anymore. I was hooked. The next few days I tried to keep the camera on a shelf, telling myself I had better things to do than chase whatever weird trick it was playing. But by Tuesday, the temptation was too strong. I loaded another strip of film and started testing it in different rooms of the house. The living room shot came out showing the same space, but the TV was an old box set from the 80s, and the wallpaper had a floral pattern that didn't exist anymore. A photo of the front yard showed the maple tree, but instead of a gravel driveway, there was a dirt path leading to a car from the 1950s parked where Uncle Mark's truck usually sat. Every picture was a window to another time, Sometimes decades passed, sometimes just a few years. It wasn't random. The camera seemed to know the history of wherever it was pointed. By Thursday, my uncle had started noticing how much time I was spending with it. "Listen," he said one night over dinner, "it's not healthy. That thing doesn't belong here. Whatever it's showing, you think it's dangerous?" I asked. "I think it's not for us," he said, his voice firm. "Present. And that never ends well. You start living in the past. You stop living in the I didn't argue, but I didn't put the camera away either." That night, after Mark went to bed, I decided to try something different. I took the camera to my bedroom, shut the door, and aimed it at my own reflection in the mirror. When the photo developed, it wasn't my current reflection staring back. It was me, maybe 10 years ago, sitting on a bed in an apartment I hadn't lived in since my 20s. My hair was shorter, my clothes were different, and I looked lighter somehow, happier. I held the photo for a long time before sliding it into a drawer. That was when the thought first crossed my mind. If it can show the past, maybe it can show the future. The idea wouldn't let go of me. I told myself it was just curiosity, but it was more than that. There was a weight behind it, like the camera wanted to show me something. On Friday night, I closed my bedroom curtains, switched on the bedside lamp, and aimed the lens at the room. I pressed the shutter, the whir filling the quiet space, and waited for the image to appear. When it finally came into focus, the breath left my lungs. The picture showed my bedroom, same walls, same lamp, but I was lying in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. A dark figure loomed over me, its shape just barely human, leaning close as if whispering into my ear. In the bottom right corner of the photo was a timestamp, October 8th, 2019. 3 days from now. I stared at it for so long that my eyes burned. Every time I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, my gaze would drift back to that shadow. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. When October 8th arrived, I locked my bedroom door, turned on every light, and sat upright in bed with the camera on my lap. Hours passed in silence. The clock hit midnight, and that's when the light flickered. Something shifted in the air, subtle but sharp, like the pressure before a storm. My skin prickled. I felt movement at the foot of my bed, but I couldn't make myself look. The camera, still resting in my hands, suddenly clicked. The picture slid out on its own. I haven't developed it, and I'm not sure I ever will. The undeveloped photo sat on my desk for days, its blank square face down, like a secret I couldn't decide whether to hear or keep buried. Uncle Mark noticed my jumpiness. Morning, pouring coffee. "You look like you've been through something," he said one. "I think I have," I muttered. "You're not going to tell me, are you?" he asked. I shook my head. I didn't want to drag him into whatever this was. That afternoon, I thought about destroying the photo, ripping it up, burning it, anything to make the possibility it contained disappear. But my hands wouldn't cooperate. Something in me needed to know. Not out of courage, more like the gnawing kind of curiosity that keeps you awake at night. I waited until evening, turned off the lights in my room, and sat at the desk. I slid the photo from its plastic sleeve and shook it gently, watching as the image slowly formed. It was me. Not sleeping, not dead. Just lying in bed exactly as in the earlier photo, except now the shadow wasn't leaning over me. It was sitting beside me, its outline sharper, as if it had decided to stay. Its head was tilted toward mine, and though it had no face, I could feel its attention. I put the photo back in the drawer and locked it. The camera went into a box in the attic, buried under old coats. But I still hear the click sometimes at night, even when I'm not holding it. A week later, I caught myself avoiding mirrors, afraid the shadow might be standing there. The thing about the camera wasn't that it showed the past or the future. It was that it showed truths you weren't ready for. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. I never went to another yard sale after that. Some objects don't just hold memories, they keep them alive. and they remember you in return. Some doors stay closed for a reason. The need to know can be stronger than fear, but once you uncover certain truths, they can't be put back. Curiosity might lead you to discovery, but sometimes it leads you somewhere you can never come back from.